Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan, and joining me today for a very special episode of the show is Lord Bhikhu Parekh, eminent political philosopher, London-based, author of several important books on Indian political thought, Indian philosophy, and author most recently of a book called Debating India, which consists of a large number of his essays on the tradition of debate and disputation in India, going back in history and, of course, in the present time. Welcome to the show, Professor Parekh.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you, in particular because many of the themes in your book resonate with what's unfolding around us in the country, and we will come to that in the latter half of the show. Mm-hmm. But in order to plunge in, I want to get from you your sense of the Indian tradition of debate, dialogue. Amartya Sen made famous this concept of the argumentative Indian. You have chosen to call your book Debating India, which suggests that the kind of debate that we've seen traditionally in India was rather more structured, rather more organized, not disputational. Would you care to elaborate on what you feel is the Indian tradition of debate?
Well, I think so far as Amartya Sen is concerned, he wrote a splendid book which justly became famous. While admiring it, I part company with it in several respects. And I think one of the couple of important differences between him and me, when he talks about argumentative Indian, he's talking about the Indian. Whereas I'm not sure that I would call the Indian argumentative. Because argumentative would tend to imply somebody who argues for the sake of arguing.
Right.
I would rather talk about a tradition, not an individual. So I talk about debating India, not the debating Indian.
Right.
And the other thing is, when he talks about argumentative Indian, he thinks about individuals arguing, talking to each other at an interpersonal level. I'm interested in a tradition which is unique to us in human history. I can't think of any other country, and I have studied quite a few, where you have a tradition of publicly organized, publicly monitored, publicly presided over debate in front of thousands and thousands of people. Now that is unique to us, and it goes back to the time of the Buddhist period. When a debate...
The Greeks didn't have this system?
No, they didn't.
Not in that way, huh?
Not in the, I mean, Socrates, Plato's dialogue.
Right.
I mean, here is an individual who goes to the agora, the Greek marketplace.
But the agora is a sense of having public there and people there.
Yes, but here is the guru-like figure who sits there,
Right.
and any individual from the audience would ask him a question and he will answer it, but at the interpersonal level.
Right, okay.
What you don't have is the agora in the sense of being pre-organized, presided over by the local king or by the local priest, where there is a disputation going on, lasting not just an hour, or in the case of few seconds, as in the case of Socrates, but lasting for days and days and days. I mean, there was Ashoka's time, or in the time of the 19th century, between the Hindus and the Christian missionaries, the debate is going on for about 3 weeks.
Right.
Now, those kinds of public, if you call them public spectacles, if you like, have been unique to our tradition, and I have been fascinated by this. And this particular book is an attempt to concentrate on exploring the intricacies and the mechanism of that tradition.
So, the tradition of debate in India, as you say, goes back a long time. It was structured, it was organized, and had at least the notion of involving thousands of people. At the same time, Professor Parekh, wouldn't it be correct, and you yourself in a way talk about this in your book, that there were some areas that were more actively debated than others? I think questions of metaphysics, human beings' relationship with the universe, and the place of Atma and Brahman, etc., were the subject of fierce disputes, but not arguments or debates over the way human beings were living their lives.
Absolutely. And this is another area where I tend to part company with Sen, because when he talks about the argumentative Indian, he seems to imply that the tradition is more or less the same throughout Indian history, whereas it is not, but also that we have been argumentative in all areas. Right. And here one tends to forget the politics of argumentativeness. That the Indians were argumentative in areas which did not have a direct consequence for or immediate implications for the prevailing social and political order.
Right.
So you can talk about metaphysics, you can talk about Atman, talk about Brahman.
Right.
Although even there it begins to have social implications and there is a cutoff point.
Right.
Shankara talks about Advaita, and Advaita implies no caste system, no untouchability. Right. But when he comes to that, he stops.
Right.
So in that sense, I think what you find is debating tradition largely concentrates on metaphysical issues, epistemological issues, but when it comes to social and political issues, it tends to shy away from them.
Where would you locate, I mean, Professor Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay wrote a lot about the Charvak, the Lokayuk tradition, which in a way, took on the metaphysical sort of dominant paradigm, but then it also dies a natural death or doesn't go to the logical.
And that tradition again is largely philosophical.
Right.
It is it is anti-metaphysical within a metaphysical sphere.
Right.
I mean, he's saying metaphysics, questions about the Atman and Paramatman and so on do not really make sense. But this again, the debate is conducted in a philosophical language and concerned with issues of that nature. Whereas what I'm talking about, or what one is concerned about in the Lokayana tradition, is the tradition of exploring, let's say, the basis of the caste system. Where does it come from?
Right.
Economic inequality. One doesn't see vast discussions about economic inequality, let alone untouchability, which has been going on for at least 1,000 years. These large issues which have disfigured our society have not largely been subject of discussion. I mean, here and there, on the margins of society, Bhakti Movement, for example, or a few references during the Buddhist period, but not by and large. I mean, the dominant tradition has been pretty conservative.
But statecraft has been there. I mean, we've seen debates, discussions, some pretty subversive some of the Kurals of Tiruvalluvar, I mean, in the Tirukural, for example, some of the descriptions of the way people can act against a king who is unjust, or even in the Mahabharata, you find references.
For sure, Anushasan Parva, no. But they're all about the king behaving unjustly. And unjustly means treating his children, treating his people not as children. So again, very paternalistic attitude. And there again, there is no reference to what are the citizens protesting against. When you call a king a tyrant, what does it mean? A king is a tyrant when he disturbs the Lokasangraha, when he disturbs the prevailing social order. In other words, when he goes against the caste system. So again, the definition of tyranny is in conservative terms. If you are looking for a radical social message, the point that Ambedkar and others make about our tradition, I think is largely valid.
The historical sociologist Ramakrishna Mukherjee, who died recently, in his book, The Rise and Fall of the East India Company, had an analysis of the Bhakti movement, which of course comes much later compared to ancient Indian thought. But his analysis was, and this is echoed by many scholars since then, that the Bhakti tradition was the nearest Indian equivalent to, say, the Reformation movement. It was attacking entrenched power interests and inequalities in the society within the kernel or the shell of religion. Would you go along with that? Do you feel the Bhakti movement represented that impulse for confronting inequality that India hadn't shown until then? Yeah,
I think it's certainly true, although with one or two qualifications. You see, Bhakti movement, which begins in the 15th, 16th century, was also concerned with religious divide between Hindus and Muslims. Kabir, a lot of other people were largely concerned with religious rather than caste and other issues. Secondly, it was concerned with the poor and the rich. Caste comes rather low down in the hierarchy of the Bhakti movement. And when the caste does come, I mean, it's certainly some Bhakti movement people do bring in the untouchables, but others don't.
Chokha Miller, for example, was himself Dalit.
And Dalit. But by and large, the Bhakti movement, the leadership of the Bhakti movement, the elite of the Bhakti movement was itself confined to the OBCs, what we will call OBCs today, rather than the untouchables. So the Bhakti movement has to be deconstructed. There are bits of it which are heavily critical of the untouchability and all that, but the substantial part of it, again, tends to shy away, saying let's concentrate on Hindu-Muslim differences, on class differences, and try to attack inequality at that level.
Coming to debates in modern period, modern Indian history, you have, of course, written a lot, and this is reflected in chapters in your book on the Gandhi-Tagore debates. Why don't you share with us what you feel are the most relevant from today's point of view aspects of that debate?
I mean, it's a long argument, and my basic thesis simply is that Gandhi and Tagore were great in their own ways, but they each had his limitations. The Mahatma represented, if you like, the ascetic tradition of India, and in the process, he ignored the aesthetic, the arts, the literature, the sheer beauty of the universe. I mean, that he tended to ignore. Tagore, on the other hand, concentrated on the aesthetic dimension of human existence and was only marginally interested in political issues. And that shows in every sphere of life. Gandhi, for example, declared Ramayana to be the epic of India. Tagore said Mahabharata. When Gandhi looked at Taj Mahal, I mean, he said, look, this is the public display of a private emotion, a sheer waste of money.
Right.
Tagore called it a teardrop on the cheek of eternity. Every brick cries out a man's love for his woman, saying, I love you, I love you, I love you. Now, those differences, but so there are differences at all levels, but there are also great similarities, which is why they could understand each other, they respected each other. And what I'm concerned is to concentrate on 4 or 5 major issues where they both disagreed and also profoundly disagreed. For example, Bihar earthquake, which Gandhi said was a kind of punishment for the sin of untouchability, and Tagore said that's an absurd way of looking at a natural calamity. Right. Or the charkha, where Tagore said only a rustic backward country like ours will make a fetish of charkha. Or Ram Mohan Roy. So Gandhi said, look, I mean, he was a pygmy compared to Kabir. The point I was making earlier, that if you compare to Guru Nanak and Kabir and others who were able to lead mass movement, Ram Mohan Roy was limited to a few people because he didn't have that kind of contact with the masses. And Tagore said, no, Ram Mohan Roy was just as great as Guru Nanak. So those issues, and obviously non-cooperation. When Gandhi started burning foreign clothes, Tagore said, why not give it up to the poor? And Gandhi said that would be an insult because the poor man can't even look after himself. How is he going to look after this foreign refinery, foreign refinement? So the point would be that my basic concern is to take each of these issues on which they agreed and disagreed and explore in some detail why they did so.
And the debates were always fierce but civil.
Very civil, very polite, and always, although sometimes they ended in disagreement, they also ended in a good deal of mutual admiration.
We recently celebrated the birth anniversary of B.R. Ambedkar, underrated political philosopher, underrated contributor to Indian thought in the 20th century. His role and achievement is, of course, linked to the writing of the Indian Constitution, but he's much, much more than that. He was, besides other things, a fierce critic of contemporary inequalities in Indian society. And do you feel that there's been a sense in which we have ignored some of those aspects, what he wrote about Hinduism and religion, and that we continue to ignore those aspects of his thinking at our peril?
I think we do. And what we have tried to do, and here I say both the followers and the critics of Ambedkar, both have in their own different ways almost joined hands in sanitizing Ambedkar. The Gandhians have naturally a certain vested interest. But I think if you look at the others too, I mean, Ambedkar, if you look at his draft for the United States of India, where he wanted constitutional democracy, where he wanted socialism to be written into the Constitution. So here was a man who was very keen, he was a socialist. Here was a man who also wanted Hinduism to be radically reformed by the state declaring what text of Hinduism to be accepted and all that. So given all that, here was a man who was committed to radically transforming Hinduism along what he called Protestant lines. So when he was asked at the Round Table Conference, are you a Hindu or not? He said, I don't mind what you call me, so long as you recognize that I'm a Hindu Protestant. Now then, Ambedkar can also be seen as somebody who was very critical of the capitalist system. And here and also, if you like, as he said toward the end of his life, towards many of the leaders of the Harijan movement, and saying, do they really care for their people, or are they simply going to look after themselves? And having observed reservation policy in practice for a few years, he said, look, he was very utterly disappointed with them because they are only concerned with their own interests rather than with the interests of the people they are supposed to represent. So I think he has a radical thrust at all levels. And here was a man who was concerned not to compromise on any of the important social and economic and political issues. And sadly, we have sanitized him at all levels.
One aspect of this sanitization, if you will, and this brings me to the contemporary in Indian political life, is the lack, I mean, our modern day unwillingness to read and debate unpleasant things. I was reminded of this earlier this year when students from the IIT in Madras, who formed a student group called the Ambedkar Periyar Study Circle, were circulating some of Dr. Ambedkar's writings on Hinduism. And the college authorities found this so offensive, unaware of its origin, perhaps.
Exactly.
And tried to. That was one of the charges against the student group, which was then proscribed briefly until there was a huge scandal about how university campus cannot ban student organizations on this basis. But do you get the sense that in the 21st century, India is rather less receptive to the kind of fierce debates that we've traditionally seen, not just in the 20th century, but going all the way back?
I think it certainly is. It certainly is. And I mean, one can look for reasons for this. I mean, partly because we have persuaded ourselves into thinking that we are a country on the move. And a country on the move, and somebody holds a mirror to us and says, look, you are not on the move, there are lots of things that are wrong, we feel that our illusion is shattered and people tend to get worried. We are also becoming rather community consciousness, community conscious. Yeah. And therefore, when our communities, whether it's religious or ethnic or whatever, is being criticized, we tend to get rather defensive about it. For all kinds of reasons, there is a certain degree of intolerance in our society. And that has to be curbed. When political correctness is all right up to a point, because it's a way of saying, look, let us be courteous to each other, not knock each other. But at the same time, I think there's a limit to what you tolerate and what you do not tolerate. And here, I'm not entirely sure that the government or our institutions of the state have been entirely on the side of liberalism.
Well, we saw the, shall we say, the response of senior ministers who challenged many of the writers, artists who have been protesting. One can obviously enter into debate about which mode of protest is the most effective.
Right.
But there was a statement by a senior minister who said that this is a manufactured protest.
Which I think is absolutely crazy.
Do you feel that, in a way, an official response of this kind actually compounds the problem? It reinforces the argument of those who say we are living in times which are becoming increasingly fragile, increasingly intolerant.
I think it might, although I would be a little careful, because I can imagine a minister saying, look, I mean, it's not just one individual surrendering an award or two or three, but a crowd begins to follow. A kind of herd mentality comes in.
Yes.
And one might say, look, I'm beginning to suspect an organized or unorganized move behind it. I can see that. And if the minister wants to say this, then to stop him from saying that would be to commit the same mistake that we are criticizing.
Obviously.
So if he wants to say this, let him say this, and we can debate it in its own terms.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that simply to dismiss this kind of awards, people returning their awards as a kind of tamasha, is improper. One is not sufficiently respecting those people. And I think it is this climate of mutual respect, where I not only tolerate, but respect your differences.
Right.
That, I think, is in danger of disappearing if we are not careful.
One of the issues that's become current again in terms of a debate, particularly on when the country and the government recently marked what they called Constitution Day on the 26th of November 2015, was, I think the Home Minister made an impassioned plea for, he said the word secular is the most misused word in the Indian Constitution. And he made a plea, speaking in Hindi, that the phrase, the correct translation of secularism is and should be Panth Nirpeksh, as opposed to Dharm Nirpeksh. What do you make of this kind of, are these semantics, or are there wider political issues that are involved in this, in a debate of this kind?
Yes, at one level, one could see it as semantics, because for an ordinary person, or even a not ordinary person who doesn't normally think in Hindi, the difference between Dharma Nirapeksha and Pantha Nirapeksha wouldn't really make much sense. But at a deeper level, the distinction is significant. It's Dharma for our tradition means ethics. For a Buddhist, Dharma means ethics. Now, Dharma Nirapeksha means a state which is indifferent to ethics. And that immediately would get people's backside up, saying, look, what do you mean? I mean, a state which is immoral?
Right.
So what we say is, no, we don't mean indifferent to religion, we mean indifferent to sect. And Panth would specify that. But again, the Panth itself can mean many different things.
Right.
So at one level, one can see the struggle behind the wanting to make the distinction. Struggle to make sure that we are not against religion or ethics or whatever.
Right.
But we are against sectarianism.
Right.
That principle, that drive is absolutely honorable.
Right.
But whether it is articulated clearly in this distinction, I'm not entirely sure.
I mean, in the sense that ethics or dharma in the Indian tradition is also contingent on your own station, your own position, right? You see the Raj Dharma or different kinds of dharma.
Sure.
So even if we take the ethical, I mean, in common parlance, the word dharma is understood by people as religion now. and has been for the last 60, 70 years. But even if we take the meaning as ethics, a state being independent or indifferent to the ethical compulsions of its people, assuming that those ethical compulsions are often different, would then put a different gloss on this.
Yes, although when we talk about dharma, dharma for us is at two levels. There is the samanya dharma, certain common principles.
Right.
And the dharma nirapeksha would mean that the state which is indifferent to even common principles of universal morality, such as not to harm someone or not to kill and so on.
Right.
Now that I don't think is what secularism means, which is partly one of the reasons why the drafters of our constitution did not use the word secular.
That's right.
It doesn't appear even once. It is used very widely in the debate.
I mean, the principles of secularism, as we understand it, in English at least, are embodied in different provisions of the Constitution without the word being used.
Yes. And also there is no simple definition of the word, because they knew that the term is going to be so significant that rather than define it, why not embody its underlying principles into the structure of the various provisions? And this is what we have done.
Right. We don't have too much of time, but one of the intriguing aspects of chapters in your book is where you posit a debate on violence and non-violence between Mahatma Gandhi and Osama bin Laden. Why don't you enlighten our viewers on the contours of this debate? How did this idea occur to you, and where did you take this debate?
I can do that, and if there was time, I would also have explained how the debate almost got me into political trouble.
Is that right?
Oh, yes. But let me just answer your question, and then if you permit, I'll answer my question.
Yes.
I was thinking about the Mahatma. Here is a man who says, look, violence is absolutely efficacious. It never fails. Then I had to give a lecture on violence in the tradition in Western tradition. I said to myself, what would Gandhi have said about those writers in the Western tradition who think violence is absolutely necessary? Karl Marx. So I imagined a dialogue between Gandhi and Marx. And there had been a lot of stuff in Gujarati written on Gandhi and Karl Marx, because lots of Gandhians were drawn to Marx and lots of Marxists were drawn to Gandhi in the 1930s and 40s in Gujarat.
Okay.
Then moving on from Marx, who was a disciplined revolutionary, I thought of Osama bin Laden, what happened in 2001, and I said to myself, what would Gandhi have said to Osama bin Laden? He would have been partly sympathetic to what he was doing, because he would have said, look, I fought the greatest empire of my time, you are fighting the greatest empire of yours, you are a religious man just as I am, you are doing this in the name of religion just as I did. So I shared quite a bit of what you say, but your methods and your rhetoric are utterly abhorrent to me. Why is that? So I set up an imaginary dialogue in the form of an exchange of letters between them, and end up with the conclusion that at some point, up to a point, Gandhi would have been able to persuade Osama bin Laden that this is not a practical policy, because Americans would come down very heavily, which is what ISIS and Daesh and others are recognizing. But therefore, cut down on violence, cut down on the rhetoric, because it's simply uniting the Americans against you. But at the same time, when it comes to the fundamental questions, as violence being inherently bad, now Osama bin Laden wouldn't agree, Gandhi wouldn't be able to prove it. So the conclusion I reach is on fundamentals, Gandhi would not have been able to persuade bin Laden, but on policy matters, he would have succeeded in doing that.
Right.
Now answering, if you
the response,
Well, I gave this as a lecture, and then it was published. It was going to be published in a collection of articles by a friend of mine called Religion and Politics. When it was sent to the publisher, they objected to my article being included on two grounds. A, it would upset lots of Americans. This is, remember, 2002, 2003. It would upset lots of Americans. And secondly, it would give the impression that I was defending Osama bin Laden. Because you can't...
Which you clearly were not.
Yeah. Which I was not. Yeah. But then you can't set up a dialogue between a straw man and a genuine man. So I tried to make Osama bin Laden as articulate, forensically as powerful as possible. That, they thought, would imply that I was trying to defend it, and it will make me a sympathizer of terrorism. The editor of the book insisted that this is not how it should be read, this is not my line. And finally, the publisher gave in on condition that I had an opening paragraph which said, my Osama bin Laden is not a real historical individual, but a fiction which I have created out of Islamic movements of a radical nature.
Right.
Same thing happened in Britain when this article was reproduced in a very leading and important journal called Prospect.
Right.
The editor was very keen. He's an immaculate liberal, and the journal is very popular.
Yes.
They wanted to publish it, but they said, look, again, the same sort of objection as the Americans. This will give the impression of being sympathetic to Osama bin Laden, might even encourage young Muslims to join Osama bin Laden rather than Gandhi. Would I therefore make it clear in the opening paragraph that my Osama bin Laden is an imaginary construct based on a radical Islamic movement? I did that, end of story.
That is a reminder of how difficult it can be in modern times to have no holds barred debate.
Absolutely. In fact, I was told after that, I was going to the United States, and I was told that I may not be allowed into the country.
Right.
Mercifully, it didn't happen,
Right.
but I was told that this might happen.
Right.
And I had been asked to make various phone calls should that have happened.
On that note, we're completely out of time, but thank you very much, Professor Parekh, for joining us on Indian Standard Time.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that wraps up this episode of IST. Do join us again next week with another guest. Thank you so much for watching.